The story of Philip IV of Spain and of Austria, historical fiction, based on true events. The year was 1600, and two infants, born in different kingdoms, yet bound by blood and destiny, opened their eyes to a Europe consumed by dynastic rivalries and the shadow of religious war. In Valladolid, Spain, in the heart of the most powerful empire on earth, a baby boy was born on April 8, 1605. He was christened Philip, the son of King Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. His first cries echoed through the stone halls of the royal palace, where courtiers bowed and whispered, "Here is the boy who will inherit half the world." For Spain was still the empire on which the sun never set, master of territories stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. Meanwhile, 5 years earlier in 1601, in the glittering court of France, a daughter had been born to King Henry IV and Marie de Medici. She was named Anne, after her grandmother. A child of Bourbon and Habsburg blood, she was raised with all the pomp of a French princess. Yet from the moment of her birth, her life was not truly her own. She was a pawn on the vast chessboard of Europe, her future already mapped out by treaties and ambitions. Childhoods, shaped by power, Philip grew under the careful watch of tutors who whispered Latin verses and spoke of empire, religion, and duty. He was a quiet child, solemn even in play. His eyes were dark and watchful, his smile rare. "He carries the weight of Spain already," his grandmother observed, watching the boy gaze at maps spread across a table, tiny fingers tracing the outlines of Italy, the Netherlands, the New World. But the court also wrapped him in ritual and formality. From the age of 5, he was taught never to laugh too loudly, never to run in corridors, never to show weakness. One day, his tutor whispered to him, "Your Majesty, when your father dies, all of this, these lands, these armies, these ships, will rest on your shoulders. You must learn to wear the mask of kingship." Philip, still a boy, nodded gravely. Already he understood. To be a king meant to hide one's heart. Anne's childhood, by contrast, was more vibrant but no less constrained. She was raised at the French court, surrounded by music, dance, and constant intrigue. Her father, Henry IV, adored her. But her mother, Marie de Medici, saw her daughter as a bargaining chip. "You will one day bind France and Spain," Marie told her, stroking the child's golden hair. "Through you, peace will come to Europe." And was spirited, lively, with a quick wit and a sharp tongue. Yet behind her smiles lay a streak of melancholy. Sometimes she stood at the palace windows, staring at the distant horizon. "What is beyond France?" she asked her governess once. "Spain," the woman replied softly. "And perhaps, my child, your future." The Treaty of 1615. Europe was restless. The 30 Years' War loomed on the horizon. Spain and France, rivals for centuries, sought an uneasy peace. And so, in 1615, it was agreed, a double marriage would seal the alliance. Philip IV of Spain would marry Anne of Austria, daughter of France. Louis XIII of France, Anne's brother, would marry Philip's sister, Elizabeth of Spain. The announcement was met with lavish celebrations. But to Anne, only 14 years old, it was a terrifying sentence. She wept when she was told she must leave France forever. Her confessor tried to comfort her. "Your Highness, you will be Queen of Spain. Think of the glory, the duty, the honor," and replied through tears, "And what of my heart? Must it never belong to me?" Philip, 10 years old at the time, was quieter. He accepted the arrangement without complaint. Yet in the privacy of his chambers, he confided to his servant, "Will she be a stranger to me? Or will she be my friend?" The servant, startled by the boy's honesty, bowed and answered, "Sire, she will be both, and perhaps, in time, your queen in more ways than one." The marriage in November 1615, the grand marriage took place, and crossed the Pyrenees with a retinue of French ladies, while Philip prepared in Madrid. The meeting was staged with splendor. Banners flew, cannons roared, and choirs sang hymns of union. The bride and groom, still teenagers, met for the first time beneath gilded ceilings, surrounded by courtiers watching every gesture. And, dressed in silver and white, curtsied deeply. Philip, stiff in his regal attire, bowed. Their eyes met, curious, cautious, uncertain. "Madam," Philip said softly in French, his accent careful. "Senor," Anne replied, her voice trembling but clear. The marriage ceremony was magnificent, yet the atmosphere between them was awkward. They were young, shy, and strangers to one another. That first night, courtiers whispered outside their chamber doors, waiting to hear rumors of intimacy. But within, and sat nervously on the edge of the bed while Philip spoke quietly about duty, honor, and the hopes their families had placed upon them. And looked at him and said, almost in a whisper, "We are bound for life, Philip. But will you be my husband, or only my king?" Philip hesitated, then answered with surprising gentleness, "If you let me, and I will be both." And so began a marriage that would shape the destinies of two nations. Madrid. A cold welcome, 1615. The air in Madrid was different from the sweet, damp breezes of Paris. It was dry, heavy with dust, and carried the sound of church bells that seemed to toll endlessly. When Anne of Austria arrived in Spain as a bride of just 14, the Spanish court received her with pomp but little warmth. Her carriage rolled into the royal Alcazar of Madrid, a fortress-like palace of gray stone and solemn chambers. She looked around, clutching the edge of her gown. Her ladies whispered in French, their voices tight with homesickness. At the grand staircase, King Philip III and Queen Margaret, Philip IV's parents, greeted her formally. Behind them stood the young prince, her new husband, still shy and boyish despite the titles draped on him, and curtsied deeply, her heart racing. Philip approached, bowing his head just enough to honor her rank, but not enough to break his careful posture. "Senora," he murmured in Spanish. "Monseigneur," she replied in French. They exchanged a glance, not cold, not yet warm, but filled with curiosity. That night, after the ceremonies, Anne was shown her new apartments, vast rooms of velvet and gold, yet oppressively silent. She touched the walls and whispered, "These are not mine." Her French ladies in waiting tried to cheer her. But soon, Spanish officials arrived to inform her that she must dismiss many of her French attendants. Anne's eyes filled with tears. "They are my family," she protested. But the Council of State insisted, Spanish queens must be surrounded by Spaniards, not foreigners. Alone, cut off from the familiar language of her childhood, and felt the first chill of exile. Philip and Anne, strangers under one roof. Philip was 10 when he married, and she was 14. Their marriage was political, not born of affection. In the early years, they were little more than companions, sitting together stiffly at court dinners, bowing to one another in public, rarely speaking in private. One winter evening, in 1617, Anne sat by the fireplace, embroidery in her lap. Philip entered quietly, carrying a book of Latin poetry. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, as if unsure how to begin, and broke the silence. "Do you read, Philip, for pleasure or for duty?" Philip hesitated, then replied, "For both. But mostly for escape." "Escape from what?" she asked gently. He lowered his eyes. "From being watched. From being told that I must never be a boy, only a king." And studied him, surprised at his honesty. "Then we are alike," she whispered. "I too am watched. Every gesture, every word, judged. I am not Anne. I am only the Queen of Spain." Philip's lips curved into the faintest smile. For a fleeting moment, the two young royals recognized each other not as monarchs, but as lonely children trapped in golden cages. A court of intrigue. The Spanish court was a world of ritual and suspicion. Powerful ministers, ambitious nobles, and pious confessors surrounded the young couple, each with their own agenda. Philip's most influential advisor was the Duke of Lerma, a cunning man who controlled politics, appointments, and even the king's schedule. Lerma watched Anne closely, suspicious of her French sympathies. He encouraged Philip to keep a careful distance. And, isolated and homesick, sought companionship with her French ladies. She laughed, gossiped, and sometimes spoke too freely about her frustrations. Soon, rumors spread. The French princess disdains Spain. She is proud, she is foreign, she cannot be trusted. One day, Philip confronted her gently. "And they say you do not love this country, that you long for France." She looked at him, her eyes flashing with sorrow. "Would you not long for Spain, Philip, if you were sent away at 14? If your tongue, your songs, your friends were stripped from you. He paused, then said softly, yes, I would. But despite his understanding, Philip did little to shield her from the whispers. He was young, still learning to balance duty with affection. The struggle for heirs by 1619, and was 18, Philip 14. Their marriage had not yet produced children. In a dynasty obsessed with succession, this failure became a source of tension. Priests prayed, midwives whispered, courtiers speculated, and knelt nightly in the royal chapel, praying before the Virgin Mary. Give me a child, she begged. Not for me, but for Spain. Let them love me if I give them an heir. Philip too felt the pressure. His father, King Philip III, reminded him often, a king is not only a ruler, but a father of the nation. You must secure the line. The young couple grew closer through this shared burden. They began to spend more time together in private, speaking not as monarchs, but as husband and wife. One evening, Anne confessed to Philip, I fear they will blame me if no child comes. They will call me barren. Philip reached for her hand, a rare gesture of tenderness. Then let them blame me too. For we are one, and what is yours is mine, even in sorrow. She looked at him with surprise, then smiled faintly. For the first time, she felt less alone. A shadow falls. The death of Philip III, 1621. In March 1621, the court was plunged into mourning. King Philip III, worn by illness and years of rule, died in Madrid. Bells tolled for days, and black draperies covered the palace walls. At only 16 years old, Philip IV ascended the throne. He was now king of Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, Milan, and the vast overseas empire. The weight of the world fell upon his shoulders. And, just 20, became queen consort, no longer the lonely foreign bride, but the partner of a monarch. On the night of his coronation, Philip stood by a balcony, staring out at the darkened city, and approached quietly, her gown rustling. Are you afraid? She asked. He turned to her, his face solemn. Yes, but I cannot show it. And stepped closer, her voice low but steady. Then let me be your strength when you cannot show weakness. You are not alone, Philip. Not anymore. For the first time in their marriage, the distance between them seemed to close. The boy and girl who had once been strangers were now king and queen, standing side by side at the dawn of a new reign. The young king and his lonely queen, 1621 to 1630. The Alcazar of Madrid had changed. Since the death of Philip III, its chambers no longer echoed with the measured pace of an aging king, but with the restless footsteps of a boy who suddenly bore the weight of an empire. Philip IV, barely 16, wore his crown with unease. He was handsome, tall, fair, with solemn gray-blue eyes, but youth clung to him like a shadow. His minister at his side stood Anne of Austria, now 20. She carried herself with regal poise, her French beauty admired but also feared. In Spain, queens were expected to be devout, silent, and obedient. Yet in spirit was too lively to be hidden completely. In the grand halls, she smiled politely, but in her private apartments, she laughed with her ladies in French, danced to foreign tunes, and sometimes wept quietly for the life she had lost. The shadow of Olivares into Philip's youth stepped Gaspar de Guzman, Count Duke of Olivares, a towering figure of ambition and cunning. He became the king's favorite, his mentor, his guide. Olivares whispered of glory, of restoring Spain's fading power, of victories that would make Philip the equal of Charles V, Magestad. Olivares told him one night in the council chamber, Spain is weary, but not broken. With your hand upon the sword, we can bring the world to its knees again. Philip listened, wide-eyed, eager to believe. The boy who had once confessed to and that he longed to escape was now promised escape through empire, through wars, decrees, and the theater of kingship. And, however, saw Olivares differently. At dinner, when Philip spoke of campaigns in Flanders or taxes in Castile, and would touch his hand gently. And what of us, Philip? What of Spain's heart, not just its sword? He would smile faintly, distracted. In time, a marriage without children years passed, but Anne's prayers for a child went unanswered. By 1626, whispers filled the court, the queen is barren. Physicians prescribed remedies, priests urged penance, and Anne herself undertook pilgrimages to holy shrines. One night, she fell to her knees in the royal chapel, her sobs echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. "Holy Mother, grant me this gift, if not for me, for him." A king without heirs was a king whose legacy trembled. The 30 Years' War beyond the walls of Madrid, Europe burned. The 30 Years' War raged across the continent. Catholics against Protestants, dynasties against dynasties. Spain, guardian of Catholic power, plunged into battle. Philip relied on Olivares, who promised glory but demanded sacrifice. Taxes rose, soldiers marched, and provinces groaned under the weight of endless war. And washed with unease. Letters from her brother, Louis XIII of France, spoke of alliances shifting, of France eyeing Spain's weakness. Her heart was torn between two worlds, the land of her birth and the land of her crown. One evening, she confronted Philip. "My brother prepares for war," she said quietly. "If France rises against Spain, what will you ask of me? To choose between my husband and my blood." Philip's eyes hardened. "You are Queen of Spain, Anne. There is no choice." Tears welled in her eyes. "And yet, in my heart, there always is." Whispers of betrayal. The Spanish court was a nest of intrigue. Anne's loneliness, her closeness with her French ladies, and her correspondence with her brother stirred suspicion. Her servants were interrogated, her rooms searched. And herself was accused of treason. Furious, she confronted Philip in his private chamber. "Is this how you honor me? By letting your ministers treat me as a spy? I am your wife, Philip, not your enemy." Philip looked torn, his youthful face shadowed by duty. "If you are innocent, then you have nothing to fear." Her voice broke. "What I fear, Philip, is not guilt but loneliness. You believe them more than you believe me." For days, she withdrew into silence. Though cleared of charges, the wound remained. She had lost not only her freedom but her husband's trust. The first glimmer of hope, yet fate is cruel and kind in equal measure. After years of despair, Anne's prayers were finally answered. In 1607, should be 1629 historically, she gave birth to her first surviving child, Balthasar Charles, Prince of Asturias. The court erupted in joy. Bells rang across Madrid, processions filled the streets, and the empire rejoiced at the long-awaited heir. When Philip held the infant in his arms, his eyes shone with pride. He turned to Anne, whispering, "At last, Spain has a future. At last, we have a son," and wept, her tears falling onto the child's swaddling cloth. For a moment, all the pain, suspicion, and loneliness melted away. She was not just a foreign bride, not just a queen without heirs. She was a mother, and Spain's hope rested in her arms. The bells of Madrid tolled in joy in 1629, when Anne of Austria finally gave birth to a son, the long-awaited heir, Balthasar Charles, Prince of Asturias. For years she had endured whispers of barrenness, the cold suspicion of Olivares, and the silent distance of her husband. But now, with the infant in her arms, and felt the weight of her crown ease for the first time. The people cheered her name in the streets. Priests declared it a miracle. And Philip, young as he still was, gazed at his son with tears in his eyes, as though God had at last blessed his throne. For a brief moment, hope bloomed, and then Philip grew closer. She walked beside him in public ceremonies, her golden hair veiled with Spanish lace, her smile radiant as the crowds cried, "Viva la Reina!" Philip, once distracted by endless wars and Olivares' counsel, seemed gentler at home, speaking softly to and in their private chambers, his hand resting on hers as they watched their son sleep. But happiness in Madrid was always fragile. The empire that Philip inherited stretched across continents, but it was crumbling at its edges. The 30 Years' War devoured Spain's armies and treasury. Olivares demanded more taxes, more men, more sacrifice, and Spain groaned beneath the weight. In Castile, villages sent their young to die in distant battles. In Catalonia, discontent stirred. And across the sea, the Dutch, rebellious and unyielding, continued to bleed Spain in their long war for independence. Philip, urged by Olivares, pressed on. His counsels spoke of glory, of restoring Spain's greatness, of victories that would make him another Charles V. But Anne, watching silently, saw the toll it took on her husband. At night, when he returned from council weary and pale, she touched his cheek and whispered, "Philip, you are a king, but you are also a man. Do not let them make you a prisoner of crowns." He would smile faintly, but his eyes remained shadowed. If Spain falls, and then all we are, all I am, becomes nothing. As the 1630s unfolded, suspicion again darkened Anne's world. Her French birth made her an easy target. France, under her brother Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, grew bolder, challenging Spain openly. When letters were discovered passing between Anne and her French relatives, Olivares seized upon them. "Majestad," he told Philip, "the queen is not merely your wife. She is sister to your enemy. Can her loyalty truly be trusted?" Philip's heart twisted. He loved his wife, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and found herself once again under watch, her chambers searched, her ladies dismissed. Alone, she wept in the silence of her apartments, praying not for herself, but for her son, that he might never know the sting of distrust between blood and crown. Yet Anne was no longer the timid girl who had crossed the Pyrenees years before. She had endured too much. With quiet resilience, she began to carve her place in court. She cultivated allies among the clergy, among nobles weary of Olivares' arrogance, and most importantly, in the hearts of the people who admired her piety and her devotion as a mother. In 1635, war erupted between Spain and France. Brother turned against sister. Anne's heart was torn, but she stood beside her husband. "Spain is my home," she declared. "Whatever my birth, my blood belongs now to this land." It was not an empty gesture. While armies clashed in Flanders and Italy, Anne dedicated herself to charity, visiting hospitals, caring for the poor, becoming a figure of hope for those crushed by war's burdens. But even as she rose in strength, tragedy lurked. The royal nursery, once filled with laughter, grew silent. Of the children she bore, many did not survive infancy. Each loss cut her soul deeper, and even Philip, whose affection for Anne waxed and waned with politics and pressures, could not console her. Only little Balthasar Charles remained, a bright, spirited boy with his father's poise and his mother's warmth. All of Spain pinned its hopes on him. By the 1640s, storms battered Philip's throne. Rebellion broke out in Catalonia in 1640, and worse still, Portugal rose in revolt, reclaiming its independence after 60 years under Spanish rule. Olivares' dream of a resurgent empire was crumbling into ruin. The once mighty Count Duke, who had towered over Philip and the court, now became hated, blamed for every failure, every tax, every lost province. And watch carefully. She had never forgiven Olivares for his cruelty toward her, for the years he had poisoned her marriage with suspicion. Now, at last, the tide turned. In whispered conversations with trusted courtiers, in subtle remarks to Philip, she urged caution, reflection, and slowly, Philip began to see what his wife had always known. Olivares had overreached. His glory had turned to arrogance. In 1643, Olivares was dismissed, banished from court. When the decree was read, Anne stood tall beside her husband, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable. Yet in her heart, she gave thanks. The shadow that had darkened her life for 2 decades was gone. At last, she could breathe. Philip, now older and wearier, leaned on her more. His reign, once filled with youthful dreams of conquest, was now marked by exhaustion and loss. And Anne, matured by suffering, became not only his companion but his advisor. In council, she spoke with quiet authority. In private, she counseled mercy, patience, and faith. Spain's golden age was dimming. The empire stretched too far, its enemies too many, its resources too thin. But within the Alcazar, Anne of Austria had become something greater than the lonely bride of her youth. She was now the heart of the monarchy, a queen of steel wrapped in grace. And yet, fate was not finished with her. For in the coming years, the joy she had clung to, her beloved son, Balthasar Charles, would be taken from her, plunging both her and Philip into despair that would change them forever. The spring of 1646 arrived in Madrid with blossoms on the almond trees and songs in the courtyards. But inside the royal palace, a shadow crept silently toward the throne. Balthasar Charles, the Prince of Asturias, was 15 years old. Tall, spirited, with the dark eyes of his father and the bright warmth of his mother, he was the very embodiment of Spain's hopes. Everywhere he went, courtiers bowed with reverence. Nobles whispered, "Here is the prince who will save Spain, who will restore the empire's glory." Even the weary Philip, crushed by rebellion and endless wars, found renewed strength in the boy. When Balthasar sparred in the tilt-yard or addressed the court with youthful confidence, Philip's eyes glistened with pride, and adored her son with all her soul. For years she had endured loss after loss, the tiny coffins of infants carried through the palace corridors, prayers unanswered. But Balthasar lived, and in him she saw not only the continuation of a dynasty, but her own redemption. He was her laughter, her courage, her reason to rise each day. "My son," she would whisper, stroking his hair, "you are Spain's dawn after a long night." But in Zaragoza, where the court had traveled for ceremonies, whispers began of a fever. At first it was nothing, a cough, a faint weariness. "The prince is young, strong," the physicians assured. "He will recover in days." Yet days became nights of restless tossing, his skin burning, his breath shallow. And never left his side. She held his hand, prayed over him, placed cool cloths on his brow. "Courage, my child," she murmured. "You are strong. You will rise, and we will return to Madrid with songs." Philip too hovered, torn between kingly duties and fatherly desperation. He summoned the best doctors, commanded prayers in every church, offered riches to monasteries if only God would spare the boy. The courtiers walked in silence, the air heavy with dread. For all of Spain knew, if Balthasar Charles were lost, the empire's future would dim beyond repair. On October 9, 1646, the prince's strength failed. His voice, once ringing with youthful pride, faded to a whisper. He looked at his mother, tears glistening in his eyes. "Madre," he murmured, "forgive me. I wish to be a great king," and clasped him fiercely, choking on her sobs. "You are great, my son. You are my heart, my joy. No crown is greater than the love I have for you." Philip stood by the bed, his face a mask of stone, but his hands trembled. The weight of empire, the endless wars, the failures and rebellions, none of it compared to this. His heir, his dream, was slipping away. As the boy's eyes closed, Philip turned, unable to bear it, tears finally breaking free down his cheeks. When the bells of Zaragoza tolled that night, announcing the death of the Prince of Asturias, a cry of grief swept through Spain. Men and women knelt in the streets, weeping openly. In villages and cities, prayers rose like smoke to heaven, but no prayer could change the truth. The hope of Spain was gone. In the palace, and collapsed in despair. For days she refused to eat, refused to rise from her bed. "Why, Lord," she cried, "take me instead. I have given you child after child, and still you take them from me. Why this one? Why my Balthasar?" Her ladies wept with her, powerless to soothe their queen. Philip wandered the corridors in silence, haunted by his son's voice. The court saw him transformed, once proud, now broken, his shoulders bowed under invisible weight. He had been king of the mightiest empire, yet he could not save the one life that mattered most. The loss shattered not only their hearts, but the monarchy itself. Without Balthasar Charles, the succession fell to Philip's younger children, frail, sickly, uncertain. The question of Spain's future grew darker. Would the Habsburg line survive? Would the empire endure? And yet, even amid grief, Anne began to change. From her sorrow, a new strength was born. She rose from mourning with a fierceness none had seen before. She devoted herself to faith, but also to influence, guiding Philip gently, advising him with wisdom sharpened by suffering. She became the quiet pillar of the court, respected even by her enemies. One evening, in the silence of their chambers, Philip sat beside her. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "And," he whispered, "I have failed as a king. I have failed as a father." She turned to him, her grief still raw, but her voice steady. "No, Philip. We are human before we are sovereigns. We cannot command life, nor death. But we can command how we endure. Our son is gone, but Spain remains. For his memory, we must go on. Philip took her hand, something he had done rarely in their long years of marriage. For a moment, they were not king and queen, not Spain and Austria, but only two parents bound by the same wound. In that moment, and strength gave Philip what he had lost, the will to continue. The years after Balthasar's death were darker, quieter. The empire faltered, wars dragged on, and Philip grew older, more weary. Yet beside him stood Anne, no longer the uncertain foreign bride of her youth, but a queen of sorrow and resilience. And though fate would continue to test them, her presence would shape the destiny of Spain in ways neither could yet see. For Anne of Austria, the greatest tragedy of her life had also forged her truest role, not only as queen consort, but as the heart of a fading empire, the silent strength behind a broken king. The Palace of Madrid never fully recovered from the silence left by Balthasar Charles. For years afterward, the echo of his absence lingered in every corridor. Philip IV, once proud and unyielding, grew older, heavier, and more withdrawn. His beard, once dark, turned to silver, his step slowed, and his eyes bore the shadows of a man who had carried too many burdens. And, though, had changed differently. Tragedy had burned her, but it had also sharpened her. The timid young bride who had once struggled to find her place in a foreign court was gone. In her place stood a woman of resolve, cloaked in dignity, who spoke less, but whose words carried weight when she chose to speak them. Spain needed strength, and strength often came not from the throne, but from those who stood beside it. In 1651, after years of despair, Philip's court stirred with hope again. The queen gave birth to a son, the boy who would become Charles II of Spain. The bells rang across Madrid, but in the hearts of many, celebration was mixed with fear. For Charles was frail from the start, small and sickly, his cries weak. The physicians whispered, though never too loudly, that the child might not live long. And, however, refused to see weakness. She clutched her son close, prayed over him, and vowed that this child would endure where others had not. "You are chosen," she whispered to the infant in the quiet hours of the night. "You are the reason I still breathe. You must live, for all of Spain depends on you." Philip adored the boy, though in him he saw both blessing and curse, the last hope of the dynasty, but also a reminder of decline. His empire had shrunk. Portugal was lost, the Netherlands burned in rebellion, and war with France bled the treasury dry. Spain was no longer the giant it had been when he first took the crown. Sometimes, in the solitude of his chamber, Philip wondered if it had all been in vain. "Spain is tired," he confessed to in one evening, gazing at the flickering light of the candles. "I am tired. When I was young, I believed we could rule the world forever. But now, I see only shadows," and placed her hand over his. "Empires rise, Philip, and they fall. But our duty is not to despair. It is to preserve what we can, to hold the line until God decides otherwise. And we still have Charles. For him, we must endure." As the years passed, Anne's influence at court grew quietly. She learned to navigate the rivalries of ministers, the ambitions of nobles, and the whispers of foreign ambassadors. Courtiers began to realize that behind the king's weary figure stood a queen who observed everything, who missed nothing. But fate pressed forward. By the early 1660s, Philip's health was failing. Gout tormented him, his body was swollen, and his spirit weakened. Yet he clung to the throne, unwilling to leave his fragile son unprotected. On a cold autumn night in 1665, the king called for Anne. The palace was silent, the courtiers waiting beyond closed doors. Philip lay on his bed, pale and struggling for breath, and knelt beside him, taking his trembling hand. "My queen," he whispered, his voice thin. "It is ending." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back. "No, Philip. Rest. You must not." He shook his head weakly. "Listen. You must be strong. For Charles. He cannot rule alone. He will need you. Spain will need you." Her heart ached, but she answered firmly, "I will protect him. I will protect Spain." For the first time in years, Philip's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I know you will. You are stronger than I ever was." By dawn, Philip IV, King of Spain and Portugal, was dead. The bells of Madrid tolled again, as they had for Balthasar Charles, but this time they rang not only for grief, but for the end of an era. The courtiers wept openly. The empire that had once stretched across the globe had lost its master. And then, all eyes turned to Anne. The council declared her regent of Spain for her 4-year-old son, King Charles II. The once young Austrian bride, mocked and doubted, now held the fate of the empire in her hands. She wore black for mourning, but her posture was unbending, her gaze resolute. In her first days as regent, she gathered the ministers. The grandees whispered among themselves, some doubting that a woman, a foreign-born woman, could rule Spain, and silenced them with calm authority. "My lords," she said, her voice steady, "the king is too young to govern. Until he is of age, his will is my will, and his will is the will of Spain. You may whisper, you may doubt, but you will obey." From that day, the court began to shift. Ambitious nobles sought her favor, foreign ambassadors tested her resolve, and stood firm. She leaned on trusted advisers, most controversially Father Nithard, her Jesuit confessor, who became her chief minister. His influence over her was questioned, resented, even hated, yet and defended him fiercely. Whispers spread through Madrid. The queen is strong, but she trusts too much in priests. Rival factions plotted, intrigues thickened, and the regency became a battlefield of politics and power. But Anne never faltered. Each morning she rose early, attended council meetings, signed decrees, and balanced the fragile state of Spain against the ambitions of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. She fought to secure alliances, to preserve her son's throne, to keep the empire from collapsing into chaos. And at night, when all was quiet, she would sit by Charles's bedside, stroking his thin hair as he slept fitfully. "You will not be alone," she whispered to him. "I will not let them break you. You are king, my son. You are king." For 9 years, and ruled as regent, enduring plots, rebellions, and betrayals, yet never surrendering. She faced challenges that would have broken lesser monarchs, but sorrow had forged her into steel. When she died in 1666, her legacy was debated, her choices questioned, her reliance on Nithard condemned by many. Yet even her enemies admitted one truth. Without Anne of Austria, the Spanish monarchy might have collapsed entirely. She had come to Spain as a young bride, uncertain and overlooked. She left it as a queen who had carried the empire on her shoulders, who had buried kings and princes, but who had never let grief destroy her duty. And though history often remembers her only as the mother of Charles II, those who truly knew her remembered something more, that in the darkest years of Spain, when hope seemed lost, it was Anne of Austria who stood firm, who endured, who kept the crown alive. She faced challenges that would have broken lesser monarchs, but sorrow had forged her into steel. When she died in 1666, her legacy was debated, her choices questioned, her reliance on Nithard condemned by many. Yet even her enemies admitted one truth. Without Anne of Austria, the Spanish monarchy might have collapsed entirely. She had come to Spain as a young bride, uncertain and overlooked. She left it as a queen who had carried the empire on her shoulders, who had buried kings and princes, but who had never let grief destroy her duty. And though history often remembers her only as the mother of Charles II, those who truly knew her remembered something more, that in the darkest years of Spain, when hope seemed lost, it was Anne of Austria who stood firm, who endured, who kept the crown alive. And though history often remembers her only as the mother of Charles II, those who truly knew her remembered something more, that in the darkest years of Spain, when hope seemed lost, it was Anne of Austria who stood firm, who endured, who kept the crown alive.